Right, at last, you might say, we're coming round to the organisation of a confined water teaching presentation. I did leave it to last, and the reason I did is because by now you've probably realised that there's quite a lot of stuff that we've covered. I mean, if we go back to the beginning of the course, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the importance of all the stuff that's on the board by now, stuff that you're getting a little bit more familiar with. And then there were ways that we could make the briefing much more student-centred, the debriefing student-centred, and the demonstration, and as we go on. There's been quite a lot covered in that, and what I would strongly recommend that you do is watch those videos, over again, particularly after you've gotten involved in some other teaching sessions in real life, and then go back and watch them again. And I think that you'll find that the more times you watch them, the more relevant it becomes, and the more you understand what I'm trying to get across in these sessions. So it's an exciting journey ahead for you, and I promise you, your students are absolutely going to love you for treating them in this way. It's really good. So now we're going to start talking about the organisation. I find it a bit difficult sometimes because people think that I talk about asking students to do skills neutrally buoyant. Many years ago, I was explaining this this same system, and I was using the word neutral buoyancy, and a lot of people thought it was a good idea and they cottoned onto it. But the word neutral buoyancy then, it means like hovering, doing skills while hovering. Well, I don't expect open water students to be that good. So I then changed the word from neutral buoyancy to natural buoyancy. So what I'm asking people to do is this in natural buoyancy. And I'll see if I can explain what that means. It's really simple to do, but I just want to explain. So let's see where we're coming from to start with, and how we can make it, like everything else we've done, student-centred and not instructor-centred. Let's see how this works. So a few lessons ago, I was talking about a pool session. Do you remember? It was an hour-long pool session, and I was in there. There was an instructor in there with 4 students, and the pool session went really well. But then what I pointed out was that each of the 4 students in the group spent less than 5 minutes actually doing something other than kneeling down, waiting for their go, or standing up, listening to a briefing or a debriefing, and then going back down again, and actually doing something movement-wise was less than 5 minutes in the whole hour. Now, what I didn't mention was something else. They didn't even dive. I mean, they was just kneeling down, waiting to take their regulator out or put some water in their mask, or bit out of air. They didn't actually dive. And when you think about how crazy that is, because, what was this all about? This is a diving lesson. They'd signed up to learn to scuba dive. And the one thing that they hadn't been taught was, to scuba dive. So they'd been taught to clear a regulator and a mask. And I find this a little bit odd, teaching people to put water in their mask when they can't scuba dive. And I know it becomes normal, we see it time and time and time again, but let's go back to, remember the staircase? Everything we learn is built on something else that we already know, and there's a progression upwards. Well, like PADI's skills, built, they tie into this quite nicely. We put partial flood of mask, full flood of mask, you take your mask off, you breathe without a mask, you swim without a mask, it builds up. Regulator, we've already spoken about this a little bit, regulator goes out, comes back in again, regulator goes over the shoulder, then the regulator comes out and you use somebody else's regulator. It builds up and up and up and up, which is all very well as far as the skills are concerned. But as I often do, I want to just get away from scuba diving just for a minute and think about anything else that you might want to learn. So, one of the obvious ones that everybody always comes up with is learning to drive a car. Now, I'm going to put it to you that the very first thing that you learnt when you drove a car was not parallel park. That wasn't the first thing you learned. It wasn't reverse round a corner. It wasn't. It wasn't a hill start. It wasn't. What you did, you was in a car park or a very quiet road and you put it into first gear and you just get moving, you drove off, you try and be in control of that speed a little bit and then you slow down and then you build up from there. Riding a bike, the first thing you learned on riding a bike wasn't to turn left or to turn right. It wasn't. It was to get your balance, move forward, and you got comfortable and got familiar with what you're doing, and then you added stuff in it. And all of the skills that you learn to drive a car, they build on the natural ability or the natural familiarization that you've given yourself by driving a car. So it doesn't make sense to me that an instructor will take somebody on an open water course and the very first thing they'll do is drop them to their knees and get them to take the regulator out and put it back in again, and it just doesn't make sense. So what I'm suggesting is just like a Discover Scuba Diving. If somebody comes along for a Discover Scuba Diving session, do you know what they do? They discover scuba. They sort of go around and swim around in a swimming pool or in confined open water. And it works. I mean, it doesn't take long for the majority of people to swim around in a swimming pool or in a confined open water. And as they swim around, they build up confidence. I'm talking about the majority of people. There are a few people that we're asking them to do something that they can't do. And you've seen them probably. You've seen these people. It could be, I'm going to pick a woman because they tend to be smaller. So we're going to get a very small woman and an instructor has put a very large cylinder on the back. And of course what happens now is that the woman keeps falling over. So when an instructor asks them to swim around a swimming pool, the girl can't do it because, they can't get the balance. Actually, when somebody spends a bit of time with that person, just lays them on the floor and just get them to feel what it feels like to lose that balance and regain it, only takes about 5 or 10 minutes. And even with a big cylinder, the woman can then swim around the pool. But it takes time to get to that stage. If you just ignored that stage and asked her to put water in her mask, I'm telling you, it's not good. It's not a fair way to progress. Another thing, I'm going to pick a man this time because, again, quite often this is the demographic of this man. Huge man, maybe. And every time he breathes in, he's on the surface. Every time he breathes out, he's on the bottom. And what you're asking him to do with everyone else is swim around and have some control about the height that they're having around swimming around. Well, he hasn't got that because every time he breathes in, he's up there. Every time he breathes out, he's down there. And so again, it only takes a few minutes for that person to regulate the breathing. And once they start concentrating on that one area, they can do it. Another thing is if an instructor has overweighted a student, the student tends to put air in the BCD to get neutrally buoyant or, to be able to swim around. Also, if they've got a shorty on and not a shorty here, that tends to push them up a little bit further. And if they've got a weight belt on with the weight lower than high, that again, so they could be in a situation like this. Everybody else is swimming around and these people, sort of every time they, waggle their flippers, they're not going anywhere. So what they tend to do is do this. And you've probably seen people like this in a swimming pool. They're in an upright position, going like this. And the reason is because somebody has asked them to do something that they can't do. In fact, none of us could do that if we was in this situation, so totally out of trim. So with those people, a little bit of work needs to be done. Please don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with wearing weight belts and not integrated weights. There's nothing wrong with wearing a shorty. There's nothing wrong with any of this. But all I'm saying is anything that causes a trim to be wrong needs to be rectified. That's all I'm saying. So But once somebody's swimming around the pool, and even with the most difficult of cases, we're probably not talking more than half an hour tops to get people swimming around. And after they've been around the pool once, I mean, they're full of beans, aren't they? And the second time it's just so exciting. And then the third time it's like, hey, this is good. And then the fourth time it's, yeah, this is fine. And after the fifth time it's like, oh, blimey, can't we do something more now? You know, it's like they're getting a little bit, because they're becoming familiar with their underwater situation that they've now found themselves in. And actually, if we've got somebody in that situation that they're swimming around, and we look at the first underwater skill that we need to deal with, which will be regulator clear, there isn't any of those divers that are swimming around that isn't able to go as they're swimming. I mean, that they're all capable of doing that. And if that's the case, it really doesn't make any sense to bring them all in a line, drop them all down, take the air all out of the BC, you put them in a line, crowd over them and ask them to take their regulator and put it back in again. They're not learning anything really. It's very little value of this learning a skill in this situation when they could already swim around. So it's a little bit difficult for an instructor and dive masters to deal with this, because we need to have perfect control. So what I would suggest that we do with a skill like all of these, first skills like regulator, regulator recovery, regulator clear first, regulator recovery, maybe partial mass flood, we'll go with all of these. What I tend to do is put 4 weights just a couple of meters around in the circle, and the idea is the group swims around in the circle. So to start with, do you remember we're on the surface, we brief a skill, we go underneath the water, and I line up the students maybe here, they're all on their fin tips, lined up here. I'd be over here, give them an okay signal, are you ready? They give me an okay signal back. I'll swim towards them and demonstrate the skill as I'm swimming towards them, they can see. And then what they would do is I would then position myself, say here, and the students would swim around, one behind the other, towards me, and then be told that as they come towards me, come to me, they can perform the skill. The assistant will be wherever the assistant feels that they needs to be, but nearly always it's over here directing them. And everything is fairly close. As I say, there's only a couple of meters here and they just go around. And you will be amazed at how powerful this is in their learning. Now, instead of now kneeling down waiting for their go, they're now actually scuba diving, waiting for their go. And sometimes they literally are waiting. So for example, if the person comes up here and they need a little bit of help from the instructor who's trying to sort something out, the person behind them is now being backed up. So they need to go stationary. You're not going to believe me, but quite often those people are perfectly neutrally buoyant because they're stationary, waiting for their go. For heaven's sake, don't ever mention the word neutral buoyancy or buoyancy, and certainly don't mention about the low pressure inflator. As soon as an instructor starts to teach buoyancy, as you well know, that's when it all goes out the window. But if they're doing it without even knowing about it, it's just beautiful. Okay? So this is the way that I would deal with it. And as we suggested before, when we were talking about the EDIP, the EDIP thing, the practice is the most important thing. So while I'm here waiting and the student swims towards me, then they just go round again. And they can have more and more goes. Once they've done it in front of me, I don't tell them that they can. In fact, sometimes I tell them not to perform the skill unless you're with a dive master or an instructor. No one listens to that. They'll be just swimming around here and just practicing the skill because they've got the confidence and they know that they can do it and it's fine. And if it didn't really work, they're in this deep water anyway. I mean, they're just practicing. They're just being allowed to learn using their own style. If they were nervous, if they felt that they needed chaperoning, they would be with us all the time. They wouldn't do it out of our range. The other thing that we deliberately do is pretend we're not watching them as well. We pretend we're not. And the reason is well, you know what it's like if you're trying to do a written exam and someone's over your shoulder. Or you know what it's like with students that are continually clearing their mask and then you go straight up to them and say, clear your mask. I mean, people freeze. So we just pretend that we're not watching them, but the control is there. It's hard work from an instructor's point of view, keeping this control while being laid back and relaxed and, but it's definitely worth it because the students are absolutely learning so fast. It's unbelievable. So it's really good. So, regulator clear. Regulator recovery. Of course, now we're swimming along here, regulator recovery. It's difficult to get the regulator behind your shoulder when you're in this prone position. And also, I think the whole ethos of learning regulator recovery is if there was like a danger, you'd know where to find it. And I think that instinctively people would sort of come up into a sort of a head up position and then find the regulator. So what I would suggest is as they're horizontally, they take the regulator out, but come into a sort of, still mid-water, not on their knees or anything. If their feet touch the floor, their fins touch the floor, it's cool, it's fine. There's no strict rules on this. There's no finger wagging. If their knees go on the floor, hey, it's cool, it's great. There's nothing wrong with this. But try and just get into sort of an upright position, recover the regulator back into a prone position and swim round. Mask clearing, it's tough for students, isn't it? It's not only have they got to learn a sequence of movements and, steps of the skill and they need to be in the right order and not only that, they're being told to perform the skill in a certain place at a certain time. There's so much going on in their minds that perhaps something like partial mask flood is a little bit too much to ask people to do in this format straight away. So what's probably a good idea is that you line people up on the fin tips and each person just breathes out through their nose without putting any water in first. You can just check there's bubble. If there's no bubbles coming out, you'd be crazy to ask them to put water in there because we need to make sure that they can do the skill before we ask them to do it. Otherwise training goes backwards. We've sort of spoken about this before. So just make sure that there's water coming out and make sure, give them like a couple of goes at clearing a mask. And once they've done that, then we can swim around. And actually for them, it's easier then to clear a mask because they're not thinking about it. They're just doing it and they're building up confidence the whole time. And most of all, they're scuba diving. They're absolutely scuba diving and picking up so much confidence and self-esteem as we go. So that's good. I just want to talk about a few other skills that can be done in a sort of a fairly nice way. And one of them is controlled emergency swimming ascent, CESA. What I generally would do is put two weights, which is 9 meters apart from each other. And I don't know how you do CESA at where you've been trained or where you're doing it, but quite often, like in my early days, this is the way it was. It didn't make sense to me, but a student would be kneeling here, being told they're out of air and they've got to do 9 meters, and then the instructor has briefed them to put air into the BCD to get neutrally buoyant, and the student might think, well, I thought I was out of air. How can I be neutrally buoyant? Well, no, not yet. You're not neutrally. Not yet. You're out of air. You've got to be neutrally buoyant, and then you're out of air. Okay, fine. So you put some air in, and you sort of a bit fin tippy or something, a bit of a fin pivot type of thing. And then the instructor says, right, now you've got to take 3 breaths. And the student says, well, hang on a minute. Aren't I out of air? No, you're not out of air yet. You will be. After you've taken your 3 breaths, you're going to be out of air. It doesn't really make sense to just do it. First of all, you get neutrally buoyant and then take 3 breaths and then you're out of air. Okay, fine. So then they get neutrally buoyant, take the 3 breaths, And then off they go, ah! And of course they always sort of lose altitude around here and then crawl along the bottom because they weren't properly neutrally buoyant, and it just doesn't make sense. However, if we've already got people used to swimming around and they're already neutrally buoyant-ish, then what we can do is after the demonstration and after, it's hard work for the assistant and the instructor sort of being with the student the whole time. But what the students do is that I'll do a different colour for a student, here we go. The students actually swim around, neutrally buoyant, and they don't stop, they just continue, but as they hit the mark, then they go into they're 18 metres a minute and they're R-ing all the time and just until they come to this weight, and then they continue. So there's no stopping. There's no change of speed either, because all this is still 18 metres a minute. And actually, once they've had 1 or 2 goes with the instructor, you can actually get them to do 4 or 5 goes because, one student's here, another one's here, another one's here, another one's here, and they're just going around, and the assistants are sort of everywhere, like they have to be, and the instructor's everywhere, and it's fine. It's in shallow water. It's just a great way to do it. Ascents and descents very similar. Again, I sort of feel a little bit uncomfortable about people kneeling on the bottom just to do a 5-point ascent, and then they do all the signals of looking up and everything else, and then they can't go anywhere, so they have to put air into their BCD in order to take it out to do the ascent, which again sort of doesn't make sense. So it makes much more sense to have a point where they are going to be surfacing, but they swim around and then just stop, and then while they're neutrally buoyant they can do the the steps of the skill, the 5 steps of the skill, and then go up to the surface, and then they can let air out and up they go. So it's very similar, and same with the descent, but those there are skills by the time we get to Confined Dive 4, where there's a 5-point descent without touching the bottom and things like that. There's no reason why that can't be done earlier as well. So, just ideas about how to conduct a confined session, and the reasons why. And this again, once again, it makes it much more student-centred. Hard work for the instructor, but all of the time you're allowing them to learn. So that's it. Great. Hope you've enjoyed it.